Olá, eu me chamo Gleice Leitor, sou diretora de Educação e Pesquisa da Oficina Francisco Brennand e apresento a vocês a série Paulo Freire, Arte Contemporânea e Educação, um projeto no qual investigamos as ressonâncias do pensamento deste educador pernambucano na produção artística contemporânea. Neste quarto episódio, intitulado Escuta como Agir Político, nós reunimos o artista e educador Diogo de Moraes e os artistas, educadores e ativistas Dom Rhine e Janna Graham. Dom e Janna representam o coletivo Ultra Red e contam para Diogo como a ideia de escuta, que é central na pedagogia paulo-freiriana, vem colaborando para as relações entre arte e ativismo presentes nos projetos deste coletivo, que lida com pautas como direito à moradia, direito à cidade e direitos civis de grupos sexualmente dissidentes. Nós desejamos a vocês uma ótima conversa.
Janna, Dom, um prazer estar aqui com vocês, poder tocar essa conversa a respeito da trajetória do coletivo Ultra Red. Reforço que as perguntas aqui que eu pensei a fazer para vocês, elas têm como lastro uma vivência que eu tive com o coletivo Ultra Red aqui na cidade de São Paulo, em 2017, quando eu e Elaine Fontana, uma colega mediadora cultural também, organizamos uma sessão de escuta coletiva no Museu Lazar Segal, conduzida pelo Chris Jones, e também com a participação da Cristina Ribas. E ali naquele momento a gente passou o dia escutando áudios, debatendo, desenhando diagramas, a partir de uma pergunta comum que enfim, nos instigava a pensar qual seria o som da crise no Brasil, naquele momento, 2017. Agora, 2022, muita água correu, a situação ficou talvez até mais conturbada do que já estava naquele momento, mas, enfim, estamos aqui hoje para conversar a partir dessa provocação, né, do Instituto Cerâmica Francisco Brennand, para falar um pouco do Ultra Red e das intersecções do coletivo com o legado do educador brasileiro Paulo Freire. Então, feito esse preâmbulo, eu vou brevemente apresentar o coletivo, depois vocês também fiquem à vontade para fazer complementos. Eu vou pedir licença aqui para ler a apresentação do Ultra Red, que tem quase 30 anos de existência, é um coletivo internacional de arte sonora e política, fundado por 2 ativistas ligados à luta do HIV/AIDS, ampliando-se com o ingresso de artistas, pesquisadores e agentes envolvidos com movimentos sociais, perfazendo hoje mais de uma dezena de membros. Formado em 1994 e ativo na Europa e na América do Norte, em países como Reino Unido, Estados Unidos e Canadá, o Ultra Red fomenta uma rede distribuída de comunidades organizadas em torno de lutas por moradia, saúde, educação, políticas queer, antirracismo e imigração. Utilizando métodos pedagógicos de escuta para questionar condições sociais, seus membros estudam, desenvolvem e testam procedimentos de escuta coletiva que visam contribuir com as lutas das comunidades com as quais colaboram. O trabalho sonoro do coletivo em solidariedade com tais grupos desdobra-se de questões como: o que se escuta? Como se escuta? Em que direção se escuta? Explorando o ambiente acústico como representativo das relações sociais, o Ultra Red dedica-se ao mapeamento sonoro de espaços e histórias em disputa, a partir de protocolos de escuta e investigações militantes. Algumas de suas principais referências encontram-se nos domínios da educação popular, da música concreta e do conceitualismo. Sua aposta é a de que os ciclos participativos de escuta contribuem para a organização coletiva e as relações sociais, desafiando-as. Como parte de suas investigações militantes, o coletivo produz transmissões de rádio, performances, gravações, instalações, textos, publicações e ações espaciais públicas. Bom, eu falo de São Paulo, Janna de Londres, Don está na Carolina do Sul, e agora eu passo a palavra para vocês e pedir para que vocês nos contem, né, de como se dá a relação de vocês com o coletivo, a atuação que vocês desenvolvem junto ao coletivo, e pedir que destaquem experiências e situações com comunidades que vocês julguem marcantes na trajetória de vocês, e quem sabe também, se puderem mencionar processos mais recentes com os quais estejam envolvidos pelo coletivo, eu acho que ajuda a nos situarmos aqui para esse início de conversa.
Do you want to go first, Don?
I would, first of all, hello, Diogo. It's lovely to be with you. And thank you so much for inviting us to be with you today. Janna, I would love, if you don't mind, I would love for you to go first.
Me to go first. Okay,
yes.
Great. Will do. Diogo, very nice to see you again. And thank you so much to everyone involved for inviting us to have this conversation about Paulo Freire in Brazil, which always feels like a very important context in which to revisit his work. So I came into Ultra Red much later than Don, probably 10 years after the collective began. I cross over between community organizing, which is something that I learned how to do in Canada with Indigenous communities in land claim struggles in the 1990s, but then went on to work in gallery and museum education and in different education departments. And at the time I encountered Ultra Red, I was working at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, but also working in the context of communities of young people fighting against the local police force, who was engaged in a number of sort of policies imported from the US to kind of clean up the streets by virtue of policing young, predominantly young men of color, who were involved in the local urban arts kind of hip hop scene. And at that moment, I was very interested in Ultra Red because of the combination of sound and political organizing. And we were using a lot of sound processes in our political organizing work at that moment. So I was following Ultra Red and invited them to come to Toronto to become a part of a project there, and so that I could learn more and so that other people I was working with could learn more about this work of sort of working with sound objects in the context of community struggle. And that ended up, interestingly, in a little walk over to a popular education center, which is where I was trained in community organizing, called the Catalyst Center. And the Catalyst Center was a training center for people, community organizers, to learn popular education strategies based on educators who had been working in both South America and Central America, so who had very strong familiarity with the work of Paulo Freire. And Don and Leonardo, the other member of the collective who was there for that encounter in Toronto, we sort of came together and realized we were all interested in sound, but actually we were all politically formed through an encounter with Latin American, South American relationships with popular education. And that became a very amazing moment. And about a couple of years later, I started to work with Ultra Red more directly. And you were asking about a project that was formative. For me, the really formative project that I worked on was I moved to the UK in 2007. And there was another member of Ultra Red, Elliot Perkins, who was living here at the time. And Don was also in the UK quite a bit. And we set up a project in the southwest of England in relatively rural communities on the seaside, working with communities who experienced racism and violent racism. And in that moment, we used a process of listening. We had several listening sessions that took place in different communities over a period of a year, listening to people talk about their experiences, but also trying to build through that listening, a network of solidarity and support for those people who had experienced racist violence. And I won't say too much about that, except that one of the issues we looked at there in relation to listening was not only the experience of racism that they had at the hands of local agencies, police, and other residents, but also looking at the charities and the framework of the non-governmental organizations that supported or supposedly supported people who experienced racism, which were setting up dynamics of listening and speaking that were, in some ways, working against the aims of anti-racism. They were privileging certain kinds of speech, asking more for victim testimony, et cetera. And we wanted to work on that, as well as working on the kind of overarching context of racism in the southwest of England. And I think you asked us to end on what we're doing now. Now in the collective, I'm still based in the UK and I'm working at the university. I'm particularly working in the neighbourhood surrounding the university that I'm at, which is Goldsmiths at the University of London, based in South London, where we're working to, again, in a context of anti-racism, but also looking at the intersection between anti-racism and speculative real estate development in a very specific part of the community that is about to be displaced and dispossessed of their rented properties, mostly working class Black communities. So that's where my work is situated with Ultra Red right now. And I work with Chris Jones and Elliot Perkins, who are also in the UK, to sort of correspond about our projects.
So hello, my name is Don, and normally based in Los Angeles. When Ultra Red first started, it was myself and one other, Marco Larson. The two of us were very involved in the AIDS activist movement at that time, talking early 1990s, specifically within HIV/AIDS activism. Marco and I were involved in the needle exchange program in Los Angeles, which had come out of ACT UP Los Angeles. ACT UP was the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, a nonpartisan group of diverse individuals united in anger to end the AIDS crisis through direct action. And that movement had a very close relationship to forms of cultural action, particularly around interrogating representations of people living with HIV and AIDS, and then challenging those representations and circulating counter representations. So the relationship between the AIDS activist movement and cultural producers was very strong in our sort of visual presentation, but also in the way that an analysis of structural inequalities and structural violence leading to the AIDS crisis were being produced by specific representations of, quote, the public. By the starting of Ultra Red around 1994, was still really embedded in the needle exchange work, that is working with people who are using drugs to provide them with equipment that they need to reduce the harm related to injection drugs and to living on the streets, and to the harm related to the war on drugs, which we saw and continue to see as a major force of harm in the lives of our community. We were doing a lot of sound recordings at that time, largely as a form of self-defense, quite frankly. We were experiencing some harassment from police department, but also from security cops who were hired by local businesses. And so we just started audio recording the needle exchange. In case we needed to go to court, we would have documentation of what actually happened. We tried to do video recordings, but our community members were really freaked out by their videos. It's a little different than it would be now, where everyone's used to having their phone out. At that time, it wasn't a phone. It was a rather large contraption. So having a small microphone was a little less intimidating. And so at the same time, Marco and I were DJing in clubs. And so the recordings that we were making at Needle Exchange started to make their way into those DJ sets. That was a very crude beginning of trying to understand what an audio recording can actually do. And it really wasn't until a few years later, in 1996, when Marco and I started collaborating with an organization called Unión de Vecinos, which organized at that time public housing residents to stop the demolition of public housing and to support community autonomy and the power of the tenants. Spending time with them every week, attending meetings, sitting and listening was a really formative experience for myself, and understanding really the political possibilities with popular education. Since Unión de Vecinos was really rooted in liberation theology and rooted in the base community movement in the United States and rooted in critical education as an organizing disposition, as an organizing method. To see this in practice on a daily basis had a huge impact on me that has continued to this day. So that really started a process of transforming what was possible with making audio recordings of communities in struggle, and to think about those audio recordings not necessarily just as counter representations, but also as codifications of representations of contradictions that communities were organizing around to mobilize both their autonomous power, but also to mobilize resistance. Flash forward to today, still in a relationship with Unión de Vecinos, but now in a much larger context of the Los Angeles Tenants Union, which I can talk about in a little bit, which has a large movement of tenants in struggle across the city of Los Angeles, now no longer just in a specific community or neighborhood of Boyle Heights, which is where Unión de Vecinos has been based, but now citywide. We have 14 chapters across the city, about 2,000 dues-paying activists, and dozens of unions in apartment buildings or apartment complexes across the city. So now the pedagogical work that Ultra Red has been developing over the years has really moved into that milieu with a team of popular educators doing militant sound investigations in that context. One last thing I should mention, that the work that I mentioned about the Needle Exchange, that continues to this day. I'm still involved in that work. And we also, from time to time, do sound investigations in relationship to harm reduction or Needle Exchange. I'm presently working with a group of folks in the city of Philadelphia, which is on the opposite side of the country from Los Angeles, where I'm working with a remarkable group of sex worker activists called Project Safe in developing a listening and sound investigation with them around basically redefining harm reduction in the present conjuncture. I think I could stop there, but that gives you a sense of where I'm at.
Janna, Don, os relatos introdutórios que vocês fazem nos ajudam a notar, de um lado, que o trabalho desenvolvido pelo coletivo está efetivamente ancorado, né, nas realidades locais, tentando lidar e responder com as urgências de determinados grupos sociais, Ao mesmo tempo que, quando vocês vão nos contando, né, das experiências que vocês desenvolvem pelo coletivo, né, é que vão constituindo a própria trajetória e identidade do Ultra Red, né? Então, como se essa identidade fosse sendo constituída na interação com grupos e lutas, né, que vão emergindo, que ora, enfim, lidam com aspectos de moradia, do antirracismo, né, ora lida com questões de saúde, né, na luta junto às questões de HIV/AIDS, e para mim, pessoalmente, muito emocionante saber que Dawn está, né, desde o início dessa trajetória. Então, aqui deixar só como uma nota. Nesse tripé, né, de referências ou de bases do coletivo Ultra Red, né, entre a música concreta, o conceitualismo e a educação popular, né, eu queria que a gente pudesse aprofundar agora, né, nesse terceiro elemento, que é a educação popular, pensando no legado do Paulo Freire e em que medida ou de que formas o coletivo interage e dialoga com esse repertório do educador brasileiro. Então, queria situar um pouco a minha pergunta para depois devolver a palavra a vocês, né? Então, fica muito claro que as agendas progressistas são decisivas para o trabalho que o Ultra Red desenvolve, num diálogo possível de perceber com a pedagogia da autonomia postulada por Paulo Freire. O respeito à dignidade, à identidade e à autonomia dos sujeitos condiz a um valor basilar da pedagogia freiriana, podendo também ser percebida nas ações desenvolvidas pelo Ultra Red. É nesse sentido que o educador brasileiro defende, por exemplo, a pertinência de se aproveitar a experiência que têm os estudantes de viver em áreas da cidade descuidadas pelo poder público, a fim de discutir com eles a realidade concreta. Daí, Freire defender a luta para não sermos apenas objetos, mas também sujeitos da história. Então, esses aspectos parecem que estão muito presentes também, né, na prática de vocês do Ultra Red. Isso, por outro lado, e aí me interessa pensar com vocês, né, exige um tipo de educação baseado numa rigorosidade metódica ou metodológica. Assim, a gente percebe que os métodos e procedimentos cuidadosamente delineados representam instâncias centrais para os que se engajam na educação popular. São eles que fomentam a nossa capacidade de indagar, de comparar, de duvidar e de aferir. Portanto, a nossa capacidade de, intervindo no mundo, conhecer o mundo. Nesse sentido, vocês podem contar como o Ultra Red dialoga com o legado de Paulo Freire?
I can begin by saying that the comment that you mentioned, Diogo, about neglected parts of the city. Yeah, it's an interesting formulation, isn't it? Because we're talking about parts of cities that are often over-attended to and over-extracted from and highly not neglected. That's the formulation that we use in terms of resources and in terms of capitalist development. But even in that regard, the extraction of value from poor communities is pretty extreme, even in spaces of underdevelopment, and how those processes and cycles of underdevelopment set the stage for future overdevelopment. At least that's been my experience in cities of the global north, how the kind of margin and center dynamic that we see on a global scale is reproduced at a local level in the capitalist centers, like New York, like London, like Los Angeles. And so seeing how that, how those those processes play out, and how communities, how poorer and working class communities really struggle for self-governance. Seems to be, repeats itself even in the global north, in the metropolitan centers. And so Paulo Freire, while I think for a lot of folks is understood as a practice, a theory, praxis, in opposition to dependency, in opposition to developmentalism. And, his whole life was organized around anti-imperialism and resistance later in his life to neoliberalism. Those same economic structures are at work in the global north, and increasingly so at this moment, which is why the rise of fascism in the US government, as well as in other places around the world, like in Brazil. So understanding how our processes and our methods, but also our commitments to the poor and to their learning and the knowledge that they produce, challenges us as cultural producers and holds us accountable as cultural producers, which kind of starts to flip, I think, some of the dynamics around contemporary art, which we could talk about in a little bit. But yeah, I think for both Janna and I, a lot of the work is these long, patient processes of working with communities in struggle that would be identified as the poor, as immigrants, and so forth. And the organizing and the leadership that they're developing themselves, and the processes that they're developing to build their own power is a big part of how we think about art practice, but specifically the sound art practice that we're involved in. I know, Janna, you have some thoughts on this question as well.
Yeah, many. I don't know where to begin. I mean, I wanted to say something similar, just in the, there are many techniques and strategies that we've adopted from Paulo Freire, but and I'd like to talk about those, but this overarching question or context of the work, I think that Dawn is talking about the context of active underdevelopment, of the idea of development itself as an underpinning logic, which sort of configures communities. That it's that in Freire that carries through as a set of commitments, but not only in relation to the work that we do within communities to support sort of self-organization and power, production of kind of powerful autonomy. There's also the issue of how those efforts, how Freire gives us some tools to see how those efforts are often thwarted by the very people who speak in the name of the poor. And this kind of the idea of identification of the contradiction, of the limit situations, that's not only applied to situations, say, between a very classic sort of the farmer and the landowner, that those kinds of antagonisms, but also between, for example, the metropolitan intellectual and the rural peasant in whose name the metropolitan intellectual labors a lot of the time, and whose spirit is often extracted from them in a very similar way to the way that it's extracted by landlords, by capital itself. So I think it's that ability to identify contradictions not only within the macro kind of power configurations, but also within these kinds of helping industries that are there and supposedly there to support the poor. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say is that something I've taken from Freire, and having worked with Freire in classrooms quite a bit, is on the one hand, the proposition of the rearrangement of the relation between the teacher and the student, but also the impossibility of that as a revolutionary project within the kind of confines of education as we know it. And Freire's later work on Guinea-Bissau, where he realizes that the pedagogy of the oppressed can only be realized in a revolutionary movement where we're reconstructing the relations and the distribution of power and resource. That's the kind of context for the pedagogy of the oppressed, which he realizes through his encounters with Amilcar Cabral, etc. But that kind of tension, I think, between identifying limit situations in very limited spaces where the kind of possibility of change is not that great, to the trajectory where one realizes the revolutionary movement is the thing that Paulo Freire's education work needs to be applied to. That we can't do the pedagogy of the oppressed without building revolutionary movements, which is a very difficult encounter for me, because it's a much bigger task than the kind of micro, identifications. Although those two scales are very related to one another, sort of working on the everyday relations in a classroom, for example, but also working towards a sort of revolutionary project that is going to overturn these kinds of processes of developmentalism that we're talking about. And then I guess two little minor things within smaller things are maybe more procedural, but the relation between codification and decodification in Freire's work, and the importance that has had for me as someone, trying to work within the arts as well as within social movements, the kind of the ability to abstract and look or listen to limit situations, to situations of contradiction, is an incredibly powerful process. It can be turned to be incredibly not powerful, and it can be used in ways that are not terribly useful to this kind of revolutionary project. But to work with people to build images or sounds around their experiences and then to analyze those is an incredibly powerful process in Freire's work. I'm going to, and then I suppose the only other thing I wanted to say is just also the kind of cycles of reflection, analysis, and action that come from Freire, but actually in our work in Ultra Red and in many of our histories, that it's not only in Freire that's important, it's the way that gets taken up by popular educators within social movements across the Americas, in literacy movements, in the Sandinistas, for example, in people organizing against the free trade agreements. That this kind of idea that we analyze and we act and we analyze again, that we're in an ongoing process, that we're in social movement. We're not teaching and undoing the teacher-student relationship, which is kind of the way it gets taken up a lot in the arts, as I've seen it over the years, but actually we're in an ongoing process of trying to name the complexities of the dynamics of oppression, but we're also trying to act on them, and then we're trying to understand what happens when we act. So there's an endlessness, I think, to Freire's provocation that sort of suggests a commitment to process and to community that is really at odds and resistant within the kinds of configurations of the project that we're used to now within both the arts, academia, and even within NGOs and social movements.
Perfeito, Janna e Don. Eu vou destacar 3 aspectos que vocês trouxeram nessas últimas respostas de vocês, para a gente poder falar do papel dos objetos sonoros, né? Então, eu chamo a atenção para algo do que vocês trouxeram a respeito de um trabalho paciente, né? Um trabalho que precisa se estender no tempo e poder também avaliar, né, as conquistas e os limites. Um outro aspecto que também me chamou a atenção é de uma busca pela redistribuição do poder, né? Acho que esse é um ponto que nos ajuda a pensar, inclusive, em matizes, né, em gradações, que se relacionam com processos que almejam a transformação, né, e que, para conseguir se desenvolver, acho que precisam se ocupar, né, nesse tempo estendido e com paciência, né, verificar em que se pode avançar, em que se consegue avançar. E, finalmente, vocês também chamaram a atenção para estratégias e ferramentas mobilizadas nesses trabalhos em colaboração com pessoas e grupos em situação de vulnerabilidade. Então, com relação a esse último aspecto das ferramentas e das estratégias, me parece, então, oportuno a gente focar no papel desempenhado pelos objetos sonoros nas práticas de vocês. E, para isso, queria só delinear um contexto para poder devolver a palavra a vocês. Então, da experiência que eu tive com o Ultra Red em 2017, do que eu acompanho do coletivo, do que vocês nos trouxeram até agora, é possível, enfim, notar que as peças de áudio utilizadas nas sessões de escuta coletiva e também aquelas que são produzidas por vocês junto a esses grupos, elas são compreendidas como objetos sonoros ou como objetos culturais, que estariam aptos a desencadear e subsidiar investigações de caráter militante. Essas peças ou objetos são previamente gravados, e sempre compostos a partir de processos sociais complexos, ancorados na realidade local, funcionando como episódios pedagógicos para o ouvido, na medida em que codificam conteúdos e materiais historicamente situados. As sessões de escuta pressupõem o compartilhamento desses objetos, que são reproduzidos e amplificados tanto para fomentar os exercícios de escuta, como para promover análises distribuídas entre os participantes acerca dos contextos examinados. Nessa linha, vocês podem nos resumir a nós, como se deu na trajetória do Ultra Red o delineamento da noção de objeto sonoro? Além disso, podem listar os principais arquivos sonoros de que dispõe o coletivo Ultra Red?
Yes, so there's many aspects to that question, and I think, why we use sound or have used sound. I mean, it's interesting because we do and have, and the origins of the collective are in sound, but it should be maybe thought in the context of also thinking about listening, which isn't always the case that we use sound objects, that the context for listening can be much broader than sort of the listening session that you might have gone to, Diogo, although that has been a kind of central kind of figure.
A sound investigation requires multiple cycles of inquiry. Take the time to become acquainted with the collective listening process. Use simple listening exercises, such as undertaking sound walks in places that have meaning for the collective. Another exercise could involve listening together to oral history interviews or other archival sound recordings. Collective listening is not an end in itself. Rather, it is a tool among other tools available for the long haul of struggle. Sustained collective listening and dialogue occurs in the context of community struggle. This context conditions the investigation and associated listening practices. Thus, the team selects a question that initiates this concrete practice of listening in community. The question guides us to listen for what it is about our world we want to keep, what we don't want, and what we want but do not have.
I guess some of the reasons for why to use sound, I mean, certainly within Freire's kind of ideas of codification, the kind of sound object as a sort of synthesis and abstraction to some extent from the context in which people are sort of living in everyday life, but an abstraction that's very, very close to everyday life. So it's not abstract in the sense that it's completely unrecognizable always, but that it's taken out of context and that it's given another space for people to process it in that listening process. So I think, there's a part of it that's to do with, a kind of, in the analysis of sort of naming a problem, often what happens is people use the language that's been given to them by the NGOs, by the prison industrial complex, by the housing companies who say there's a housing crisis. These kinds of terms become the common sense and are naturalized, obviously ideologically naturalized within communities. So sound, in its abstraction, often provokes something else. In my experience, I think all of our experiences, there's a psychoanalytic dimension to it. There's a phenomenological dimension. One of the ways we thought about sound at a certain point was thinking about the phenomenological reduction in Pierre Schaeffer and Michel Chion's work, like from the musique concrète side, which was to say, sort of reduce listening in this very committed way produces a sort of plethora of kind of levels through which to analyze the forces that are at play in a situation, and that allows a kind of effective and potentially psychosocial reading to coincide with the kind of sociological reading, which might be the one that we're more habituated towards, the one that we use habitually, and that also often shapes the kind of NGO industrial complex, et cetera. So it unsettles something, to use sound unsettles something. But there's that kind of history of musique concrète. But in the project that we did in the southwest of England, we were really reliant and indebted to the histories of dub, for example, as a sonic history, and we were using dub as a way to think about what was happening in terms of dub's ability to produce a kind of strangeness, also to language, and a strangeness, as Eddie George would say, who's a really great kind of thinker around dub in the UK right now. Just how to bring different kind of elements together that might not sit together otherwise. And in that work, we were really trying to bring together different histories. We were at a particular conjuncture of racism in the UK. That sort of history of dub allowed us to intersect with another history of anti-racism and to bring a much bigger analysis of the forces at play in racism that allowed us to also displace the narrative that racism is about a few bad people who live in the Southwest, and that the need for cultural events and celebration of culture, et cetera, which is a very habitual way of thinking about racism in the UK anyway. So it allowed us to kind of to also think in different layers and through different histories about the struggle that we were in that moment. So I think it operates on the level of the sound object in a kind of unsettling way, but also allows us to kind of make connections between eras of struggle and how important that historical analysis of struggle is when we try to attend to something in the moment, in the everyday.
I like the way that you're describing those modes of listening, disciplinary regimes, that tension between the sociological and the psychosocial. It's very helpful. Mm-hmm. I would just maybe to elaborate on one of the things that we've noticed about prioritizing listening is the attention that community members give to each other in a collective situation. And that oftentimes that level of attention, but that's in dialogue with thinking strategically, developing plans for action. Thinking of those things together is really is difficult, and this is the pedagogical work of a movement, is to raise that kind of literacy amongst your base members, so that the reflection on lived experience isn't merely a cathartic adventure, but is the beginning, the first step towards thinking strategically, collectively, and tactically. And this is where I think the listening session serves a function that's far beyond thinking, oh, those guys are the sound guys. Anyone who's doing any kind of movement building, this is the fundamental question, is how our community members move beyond this hyper-individualized experience and the articulation of hyper-individualized experiences into collective analysis and then strategic thinking. So what will help facilitate that process? So the listening session becomes a kind of, as Janna was saying earlier, becomes a new habit that the movement over time develops, so that you know the difference between, say, being in a traditional leftist space versus this kind of political organizing space where the habit is to reflect together and then build strategy from those reflections. This is not the normal political space, at least not in my experiences, even today here in Los Angeles. The codification becomes a way to formalize that relationship, that sort of process, because now you have an actual thing that you're listening to that's stepping outside of I'm listening to the person sitting next to me. That allows for some sometimes difficult articulations that, if we're only responding to the person next to us, might be inhibited. Whereas listening to a recording in the room allows for certain kinds of criticisms, critiques, interrogation that allows the group to move further. But again, for a lot of the processes that I've been involved in, the process involving the codification happens much later, or happens at the very beginning. The very beginning or much later. But at this point, I mean, Diogo, you asked specifically about the sound objects. I mean, I don't think we've ever tried to assemble a single archive of all of the objects that we've created over nearly 30 years. You know, it's interesting when you read Freire's account of the critical pedagogical work that he was doing in Brazil before the coup. It sounds like he's doing the thematic investigation work to identify the generative terms. Once they identify the terms, then they unleash the program.
They're kind of locked in.
Yeah. Got that. Made the salt, made the slides.
Got the slide set. Yeah.
Whereas we don't really work that way. There are a few objects that I have found that I've been using over the years because they do allow for thinking about time. So to be with a group of people and to play a sound object from 1994 when someone was arrested doing needle exchange. Hearing that recording now allows for certain things to be produced where the audience, the group, can identify what are the conditions of our political work that are, say, organic, that are continuing, that are structural, and what are the conditions of our work that are of this moment. So sometimes playing those older recordings can help unpack that and allow people to really, it's very concrete. You don't need to have a long explanation about the difference between the conjunctural and the structural. People get it right away. They're usually further down the road than I am. So that's where having that archive is very helpful. But many cases, and basically all cases, frankly, having a group of people produce those recordings themselves and participate in the selection, the studying of the recordings, all of that forms a collective. And so I found working with a group of people, that to be very exciting, as opposed to, let's let Ultra Red do that work. I don't really work that way anymore. I suspect, Janna, you don't work that way anymore either. So yeah, if you ever did. But to work with a group of people who go through that process of making the recordings, listening, studying those recordings deeply as a group, identifying the moments in the recording that seem to have a kind of tension that could generate discussion, and then preparing and presenting those recordings, those sound objects, that produces a collective. And if anything, I think that's what UltraRed does. UltraRed produces collectives, and I think that's what the sound, the codification process, the sound object process, can do. Not just defamiliarize ourselves in our relationship to experience, but also produce collectives.
Can I just say something about what's become a bit of like a fetishized idea of listening in recent years, and just what Don's talking about, just like to really emphasize that point of, because we have done listening sessions that are fairly limited to a sort of arts context, and they don't do what Don's talking about. They produce a moment, but they also produce a kind of affective alienation a lot of the time, and I think, which is interesting in itself, and produce a kind of symptom of what happens when you conduct listening sessions kind of detached from these longer processes and commitments to struggle. And I think that's something that we really realized over the years, was that, you know, and also now when I see listening, I don't know about in Brazil, but certainly in the European context, there's a kind of industry around listening in the arts. And I find it kind of troubling in that sense that, you know, it really, it's the sort of person with the sound in the room, you know, that's the kind of idea of listening that they're working with. Whereas this kind of idea of listening that comes out of Freire is much, you know, the codification and the sound objects part of it, but it's also how do we listen in collectives is a big question, and sort of looking at the dynamics of speaking and listening in collectives as part of that collective formation that Don's talking about. It's, you know, we produce together, we focus on things together, we grow a collective that way, but we also have a tool for analyzing what are some of the problematic dynamics of voice that are taking place in collectives as well. Who's speaking when, how, for how long, you know, those dynamics, which are kind of more micro-political, often completely disrupt the political work, and they can undermine the kind of revolutionary work that's trying to happen. And that's the kind of feminist, I suppose, also angle within listening that's been really important in the legacies of not only UltraRed, but also of feminist analysis of groups and collectivity.
A gente se encaminha agora para o encerramento. Gostaria de reter alguns aspectos que vocês trouxeram, né? Mais para o final, o Dom dizendo, né, da produção de coletivos, e aí me leva a pensar que, no caso do trabalho que vocês desenvolvem, essa produção de coletivos, ela se dá em torno do objeto sonoro, né, entendido como um objeto cultural capaz de desencadear situações e percepções que, quem sabe, no calor do momento, não estivessem tão presentes. Quando vocês dizem de um deslocamento, né, do som que é gravado num local e num momento, e que depois é levado para um ambiente outro, para uma sala, às vezes até depois, e esse mesmo objeto sendo capaz de desencadear percepções, né, e ideias, me leva a pensar na ideia do som como uma matéria, né, capaz de ser mobilizada, capaz de ser ativada, a depender do contexto de luta em questão, né? E, inclusive, isso me remete à experiência de 2017, aqui em São Paulo, quando nós chamamos o encontro com Chris Jones, né, de o som como matéria para processos coletivos. E os últimos comentários que vocês fizeram me remeteram diretamente a essa experiência, em que cada um de nós levou objetos sonoros para escutar coletivamente, né? E eu vivenciei isso na pele, de que muitas coisas acontecem quando a gente se dedica a prestar atenção, outra expressão também usada pelo Don, né? A a estímulos, né, a provocações que também nos convocam a estar com os outros a partir desse elemento mediador que é o som, né? Então, acho que da minha parte eu encerro por aqui, deixo esses últimos momentos para possíveis considerações finais que vocês queiram fazer e manifesto aqui a minha alegria e emoção de poder ter dialogado com vocês e ter podido conhecer até um pouco mais do coletivo e seguir acompanhando o trabalho de vocês e, quem sabe, colaborar em novas situações. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Diogo. It's been really, really wonderful to speak with you today. Thank you for the thought and care you put into the questions.
Indeed. Thank you very much. For us, since we are working at an international level, having these opportunities to reflect together is very helpful. And I have to say, in this context, is particularly moving for us and for me in particular. Just understanding that the history of that relationship between Francisco Brennand and Freire continues to inspire us, quite frankly. And the relationship between movement building and the particular legacy of abstraction in the avant-garde arts is a relationship that is not fully exhausted yet. So it's great to be in that context to reflect with you.